Chapter 1. Hooves pounded the earth in the distance. Jack shook his head. "I must been a fisherman." Lowering his black hooded mask over his face, he glanced back at his four brothers. Their horses snorted and stomped at the ground. "Saints! Masks on!" he hissed. "Stick to the code. You're called by your saint's name. We are thieves, not murderers. Remember yourselves, lads." Narrowing his eyes to see through the slits in his mask, Jack scanned the ribbon of road beyond the trees. The carriage they had been tracking careened into view along with half a dozen guards. Quinn nosed his horse forward, stopping beside Jack. "The hour grows late. They appear to be in a hurry to reach the next village before dark." Jack stretched his neck to one side, then the other. He took up his reins. "'Tis a pity we'll have to delay them." He kicked his horse in the flanks. He and his brothers surged forward, but then the second youngest, Rory, shot ahead. "Damn his reckless hide," Jack cursed. "What the devil is wrong with him?" "He's going to collide with the carriage," Quinn shouted. Without slowing his horse, Jack dropped the reins and cupped his hands around his mouth, shouting to Rory through the fabric of his mask. "Pull back, St. Thomas!" But either Rory did not hear his warning or chose to ignore it. Bending low in his saddle, Jack urged his horse faster to catch his wayward brother. But it was too late. Jack cursed as Rory shot through the trees into the open road, straight into the carriage's path. Rory's horse reared up on its hind legs. A shout went up from the carriage driver while the guards whirled to meet Rory's blade. Another cry from the driver grabbed Jack's attention. The carriage rocked, then listed hard right. The driver pulled back, but the vehicle bounced to the left, the right wheels airborne for an instant. Then it toppled onto its side and skidded. If his brother's recklessness had killed anyone within the carriage, Jack would beat him. Jack reached the roadside at a gallop and met the guards head on. Steel rang in a harsh clash. Fury swept through him. A guard charged at Jack. He parried, then swung. The flat side of his sword slammed his attacker's forearm. The enemy's blade dropped to the ground. One guard disarmed. Jack swung around, his sword carving into a shoulder. Another enemy blade dropped. One guard maimed. Sword raised high, he readied for the next assault, but only a cloud of dust stirred. He scanned his brothers. None injured. All had kept their seats. Then he eyed the guards on the ground. None dead. With a grunt of approval, Jack swung down from his horse. His brothers followed. In the fading light of day, Jack knew they were a terrific sight. They were all large men, and Ian, their youngest brother, at only 19 stood a hand taller than Jack, who was already well over 6 feet in height. They wore black tunics covered in gleaming black mail, black hose, tall black boots, and black hooded masks, and about their necks hung large wooden crosses. Jack turned to his middle brother, Alec. "St. Paul, check the carriage. Make sure no one is hurt." With a nod, Alec dismounted and hastened to the overturned carriage. Next, Jack motioned to Rory. "St. Thomas, gather the weapons." And then to Quinn he said, "St. Augustine, take up collection." "St. John," he said to Ian, "secure the guard." A loud screech drew Jack's attention back to the carriage. "St. Paul," he said to Alec, "what the hell is going on?" A moment later, Alec pulled a thrashing mass of silk and lace from the carriage. He set the lady on her feet. She screamed and lashed out, her fingers bent into claws. Alec freed his dirk and pressed the tip against the lady's white throat. At once she ceased her struggle, but Jack saw a droplet of blood appear beneath the blade. "St. Paul," Jack's tone held a warning. "Stick to the code." The lady screeched and shifted her gaze to Jack.
"St. Paul? St. Peter? You are no saints. How dare you make a mockery of what is holy?"
Jack turned his back on her. She snarled her fury.
"I am Lady Eleanor de Clare. You will feel the full wrath of King Edward, you worthless Scottish—"
Jack turned and lunged forward, bringing his masked face inches from hers. "I have felt the full wrath of your king." He closed his eyes, reclaiming his control. He would not take his fury out on a woman. Taking a step back, he looked at Quinn, who rifled through one of her trunks. "What has she given our cause?" "A handsome bag of coin, but that is all," Quinn answered. Jack turned back to her. He grasped the wimple she wore. She shrank away as he rubbed the fabric between his fingers. No finer silk had he ever felt. He lifted his gaze to her face. Although he guessed she had as many as 35 years, her beauty had yet to fade. He met her cold, blue eyes and reached down, seizing her fingers. 3 rings, with gems the size of blackberries, gleamed even in the dim light. She yanked in an effort to pull her hand free, but he grabbed her wrist and held her still while he worked the rings from her fingers. He dropped her hand and it flew to her throat. Jack reached for her.
"Stay back, you Scottish bastard!"
He shoved her hand aside. His fingers made contact with a string of pearls lying on skin as smooth as velvet. His gaze dropped from her neck to her chest, raking across her display of rounded flesh, pressing with every exhale against the bold cut of her bodice. Then he reached behind her neck, slowly grazing her silken skin, and unclasped the string of pearls. She screeched again, but Alec came up behind her and gagged her with a length of cloth. "Not too tight," Jack said before handing the jewels to Quinn. "Add these to the lot." Crossing the road, he swung up on his horse. "Saints!" he said. "Let's ride!" "St. Peter!" Rory called after him. Jack shifted in his saddle to look back. Rory pressed the tip of his dirk to the lady's throat. "The world could have one less English bitch in it." Jack shook his head. "I gave you an order. Mount your horse and come on. We're thieves, not murderers." Chapter 2. Lady Isabella Redesdale dipped a chunk of soft white bread into a trencher of trout steeped in cream, the same instance that her father, Lord David Redesdale, dipped his. Their hands bumped. She looked up and smiled, but her father kept his gaze downcast. She turned away and numbly brought the sodden bread to her lips. She imagined the bread was a stone that would crunch when she bit down. The din would echo throughout the great hall, and for once she would not have to eat in silence. Soundlessly, the bread diminished and slid down her throat, leaving her mouth as barren as their lifeless home. It had not always been thus. Once the Redesdale house had teemed with laughter, and a love so bright and strong it warmed the heart of anyone fortunate enough to be welcomed beneath their turreted rooftop. The 2-storey fortress was part of the once thriving city of Berwick upon Tweed, but 5 years ago all joy had fled her heart, her home, and the entirety of Berwick. Isabella raised her eyes to the tall windows that ran along the length of the hall. Light poured through. Spring had arrived, but the warmth could not be felt. Warmth, laughter, and love had been shuttered from the Redesdale house the day her father brought home her mother's body. Isabella shot to her feet, knocking the table and overturning her cup of ale. "Are you well, Bella?" her father asked. She looked down into his anguished eyes. "No," she screamed on the inside. "I have been entombed." She took a deep breath and slowly sat down. A servant rushed to wipe the ale before placing a new cup in front of her.
"Forgive me, Papa. My thoughts had turned to sorrow. I just wanted it to stop."
She had no more tears. She had cried so many over the past 5 years, enough to fill the River Tweed. And although her father had stopped crying long ago, he had retreated inside himself, becoming a shadow of the man she once knew. Isabella gazed back out the windows. Once, Berwick had been a thriving market port, the very heart of Scottish export and trade. Merchants had travelled from faraway lands to sell exotic fabrics, carpets, and spices in the bustling city centre. Her own father, whose estates in Northumberland bordered Berwick, had often frequented the Scottish city. It was in Berwick where he had met Isabel's mother, Annunziata Santo Spirito, and decided to make the city his permanent residence. Annunziata had been the daughter of a wealthy Sicilian merchant. On a clear summer's day, Annunziata and David had been strolling amid the market stalls and reached for the same piece of soft Flemish wool. Annunziata had looked up and found herself gazing into David's pale green eyes the instant before her heart ignited with love's fire, or so her mother had told Isabella on many occasions. Expecting to face resistance to the match from his own father, David had been surprised when his Sicilian lover was embraced by his parents. Isabella almost smiled, remembering how David had told the story, by adding his father may have been swayed by the substantial size of Annunziata's dowry, but her money had been of little consequence to Isabella's father. David and Annunziata had loved each other. Nothing had ever mattered more. Isabella closed her eyes and painted pictures with memories of her parents walking the cobblestone streets with their 2 daughters amid the bustle of market life. But an instant later, reality cut through the vibrant colours and her memories disappeared beneath a tidal wave of blood and death. She pressed her eyes tight against the images, but she could not escape. Love had once set her mother's heart aflame, but all love and lightness were snuffed out 5 years ago when King Edward of England marched on the Scottish city. His orders: show no mercy. Men, women and children were put to the sword. The streets of the great city had run red with blood. The invasion had turned into a massacre of unimaginable proportions. But it was not only Berwick's Scottish residents who had perished. The Great Hall, a large building dedicated to trade, had been torched, killing hundreds of Flemish merchants. Many English residents had also been slain in the chaos. Her beloved mother had been one of those tragic souls. Annunziata had gone to market while Isabella, Caterina, her older sister, and her father had been occupied in the garden. When the king attacked, David had set out to find his beloved wife and bring her home. Meanwhile, Isabella, Caterina, and their servants were ordered to remain behind and bar the door. For 2 full days and 2 full nights, Isabella and her sister hid within the solar, all the while being forced to listen to the never-ending cries of the dying. Finally, on the 3rd day, her father returned. In his arms he was carrying her mother's body. His eyes were sagging with anguish. "I've brought her home." He collapsed to his knees, and all hope fled Isabella's soul as she stared at her mother's grey skin and hollow, unseeing eyes. Isabella leaned her head back against the cool stone wall. Her father sat beside her on the bench of the high dais. In front of her, 2 long tables stretched the length of the hall, but their surfaces were bare. Even the servants could not stomach the gloom, and chose instead to take their meals in the kitchen.
"My lord."
Isabella looked toward the rare intruder. A young servant girl named Mary dipped into a low curtsy. Her pale blonde hair was covered by a sheer white veil. She wore a dark green tunic with a cream-coloured surcoat. Her blue eyes flashed at Isabella before settling once more on David. Isabella cast her eyes to the side. Her father had not looked up.
"What is it, Mary?"
she said. The girl's eyes brightened.
"A messenger has arrived, sent by your sister."
Isabella jumped to her feet, once more spilling her ale.
"Show him in, and make haste."
She had not seen her sister for 3 long years. Caterina had married an English lord with holdings in Scotland. However, border conflict had prevented travel. She turned to her father.
"Caterina has sent a messenger."
He reached out and squeezed her hand. "Prepare yourself, daughter. I can see your excitement, but the messenger may carry ill tidings." Her face fell.
"I remember a time when you used to urge me to hope for a heartful and never take for granted a mouthful."
At once her father's eyes brimmed with tears. He clasped her hand and pressed it to his lips. "I did say that." She wrapped her arms around his neck, savouring the rare moment of affection.
"You did, very often in fact."
She smiled into his pale green eyes, so like her own. But before she could draw her next breath, all light faded from his face. Despair had returned. A painful knot lodged in her throat as her hands dropped to her sides. His coldness invited fear into her own heart. She closed her eyes and prayed that her sister was, indeed, well. Caterina had been introduced to Lord Henry Ravensworth during the feast of St. Stephen at Berwick Castle. Within a month's time, he had made an offer for her hand, Caterina's first. Given her sister's celebrated beauty, Isabella could not have guessed why she bade their father accept his offer so quickly. Lord Ravensworth was more than 20 years Caterina's senior, not to mention sour-faced and hard. Isabella had begged Caterina to put off Lord Ravensworth's advances, promising that someone better suited to her taste would come forward with an offer. But when pressed, Caterina declared she loved him, and perhaps she did. Isabella liked to imagine there was a hidden side to Lord Ravensworth that was kind and attentive, although given his unrelenting scowl, she knew this was doubtful. More than anything, Isabella suspected her sister married to leave Berwick and its legacy of misery behind. Regretfully, that also meant leaving Isabella behind. Ravensworth Castle sat more than 7 leagues north into Scotland. Mary came shuffling back into the room. Following behind her was a young man of slim build, with brown curls that clung to his sweaty brow. He crossed the hall and stood before the high dais, bowing low at the waist. Isabella could not wait.
What word have you brought from Caterina? What does my sister say?
A smile stretched his face wide, showing bright, even teeth. It is my great pleasure to share the happiest of tidings. Lord Henry Ravensworth and Lady Caterina Ravensworth have been blessed with their first child, a boy baptised Nicholas Henry, the heir to Ravensworth Castle. Isabella clasped her hands together.
A baby!
She turned to her father. He looked dumbstruck. She grabbed his arm.
Father, did you not hear? Caterina has a son.
He slowly stood, brows raised, the beginnings of a smile tugged at his lips. A son, he whispered. Laughter bubbled up her throat, and she threw her arms around her father's neck. She pulled away again just as quickly.
Papa, we must go to her.
Her father froze. His smile vanished. Shaking his head, he thrust out his hands. That is not possible. She gaped at her father.
Mother would wish you to go.
No, Bella. He turned away from her. Her arms hung helplessly at her sides as she watched his cloak of anguish once more wrap around his stooped shoulders. She had lost him again to the cold grey fog of grief. She steeled her heart and stared at her father's shadow.
May I go?
He eased back down on the bench and rested his face in his hands. Her heart sunk. Surely he would not deny her.
Lady Redesdale.
Isabella swung around to find Mary once more standing in the arched doorway. Behind her stood another man. He had thick grey hair and stern, dark eyes.
Yes, Mary. Another messenger, my lady, sent by Lord Percy.
Her father gasped, drawing her gaze. To her surprise, his nostrils flared and he narrowed suspicious eyes on the new messenger. Isabella placed a hand on his tense shoulder. His body eased at her touch. She looked down and saw his brow unfurl. After several moments, he shifted his gaze away from Lord Percy's messenger back to the young man still standing in front of them. "What is your name?" he said. "Thomas, my lord." "Thomas, how are our borders? Is it safe enough for travel?" The young man pulled at the thin whiskers on his chin. "Our borders have been peaceful for some weeks now. But mind you, the journey would not be without some risks, thieves and the like. Still, the distance is fewer than 7 leagues. Lord Redesdale's gaze shifted to look out the windows, but he crossed his arm over his chest and patted Isabella's hand still at rest on his shoulder. In a quiet voice he said, "You may go." Her hands flew to her lips. Relief untwisted her stomach. She leaned down and pressed a kiss to his cheek.
"Thank you, Papa."
A throat cleared near the doorway. Isabella turned and locked eyes with Lord Percy's messenger. He scowled, clearly not appreciating having been kept waiting. She glanced at her father, who continued to speak to Thomas, ignoring the other man's displeasure. "Make haste to the kitchen, Thomas. Find my manservant, William. Tell him to begin preparations for Lady Redesdale's journey north. She will depart in 2 days' time." Thomas nodded eagerly. "Lady Ravensworth will be most pleased by this news." He turned and bumped headlong into a maid carrying a tray laden with their next course. The dishes clattered to the ground. "My lord," the other messenger said, stepping over the spilled food and broken dishes. Not waiting for Isabella or her father to grant him leave to speak, he continued, "Lord Percy is concerned that our peaceful borders are making some of the lords complacent. Rumours have spread of talk against the king's campaign north into Scotland. Lord Percy hoped that, given the unfortunate events surrounding your wife's death, that your support would be readily offered." Isabella's stomach clenched. She glanced down at her father's white knuckles as he gripped the edge of the table. Slowly, he stood, his hands now tight fists at his sides. "And why would I offer my support?" His voice grew louder with every word spoken. A cruel smile twisted the messenger's lips. He appeared to delight in her father's anger. "Because, my lord, the Scottish people killed your wife." Isabella gasped at the blatant lie. Moving faster than he had in years, Lord Redesdale stormed around the high dais, his eyes bulging wide. "Get out!" he shouted. "Get out of my house!" The messenger stepped back, slipping on the spilled food. He regained his balance and eyed his soiled shoes with disgust. "Lord Percy will not be pleased." "Get out!" her father yelled. His chest heaved as he laboured to breathe. Isabella rushed to her father's side. The messenger scowled at them. "You would do well to remember Lord Percy is favoured by King Edward. You have been warned." Then he turned on his heel and left. Chapter 3. Isabella stepped out into the courtyard just as a coach bearing the Trevelyan coat of arms clattered through the gate.
"Damn,"
she muttered under her breath before forcing a smile to her lips. Her betrothed, Lord Hugh Trevelyan, smiled when he saw her. "Dearest Isabella." He brushed his lips against her gloved hand. His light brown hair grazed his shoulders, and his fine, blue eyes shone bright. She dipped in a low curtsy.
"You have come to see me off?"
He smiled. "Of course, dear friend. I only wish I could accompany you, but responsibilities hold me in town for the next fortnight. Are you quite certain your journey cannot wait?" She smiled but shook her head.
"I am anxious to see my sister and meet my new nephew."
His lips parted slightly, as if he wished to ask her again, but then he pressed them closed and for a moment cast his gaze to the ground. "I am happy for you," he said, still keeping his eyes averted. Her own stomach fluttered with excitement.
"I cannot believe I am to be reunited with Katerina. It feels like a dream."
He smiled and stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "I think this trip will be good for you. You will see how content your sister is now that she has wed and started a family." Tears stung her eyes.
"Indeed, I hope to find her very happy."
"When we are wed, you will be equally as content. Love will grow, Bella. Are not friendship and respect the strongest foundations for any marriage?" She nodded, pressing her lips together to fight back her tears. She had heard his defence of their forthcoming nuptials time and again. "But I do not love you," her heart screamed. A rumbling announced the arrival of her carriage.
"Thank you for coming, but I must go now."
She turned away and allowed the footman to help her into the carriage. Hugh peered at her through the window. "I know I can make you happy, Bella." She looked into his warm blue eyes and saw the boy she once knew. There had been a time when she had thought of him as her brother.
"I miss the way we were,"
she said. Then she leaned her head back against the smooth, velvet cushion.
"I miss the way everything was."
Regret gripped her heart as her carriage rolled forward through the gate and into the city. After King Edward had sacked Berwick, his first command was the construction of a massive outer wall. For 5 years, Isabella had watched the walls climb higher and higher. They blocked the view of the sea and countryside, confining the city. But even as she left the city limits behind, she knew men would continue to erect her king's dream. Just one more cage for her soul to silently rage against. However, the further from Berwick and Hugh she rode, the easier it became to forget. Rolling hills invited her gaze with a feast of sunshine and flowers. Leaning out the window, she shifted in her seat so she could turn her face to the sun. She slid her finger along the rim of her fitted wimple, which entrapped her hair and neck, letting the sun touch only her cheeks. Still, golden heat eased her spirit. She inhaled the fragrant scent of bluebells. A smile suddenly stretched her lips wide. It grew wider still, until her cheeks ached with delight. The rich scent of flowers and earth combined with the brightness of light, so that she felt as if she were seeing these things for the very first time. And in a way, she was. She had not left Berwick in 5 years, and the Bella who had journeyed from home before was not the same Bella now riding through the countryside. The other Bella had a mother. The other Bella could never have guessed at the cruelties one man could inflict upon thousands of others. Shadow fell as the road snaked through a thick wood. Still leaning out the window, she marvelled at the lush green underbrush that shivered with foraging creatures. Then she jerked back in her seat. She heard thunderous snaps, fast and furious, coming from up ahead, followed by a thud that shook the ground like a giant's footfall the instant before an explosive crack shuddered through the carriage, bringing it to a halt. She slammed forward, then pitched back. Wincing, she righted herself in her seat. The clang of swords stung her ears, and the cries of men her heart. The iron scent of blood filled the air. Her chest heaved as she fought to breathe. Swords and twisted faces flashed past her windows. Trapped. She had to get away. The door jerked open, a leering face. She kicked. The grappling hand retreated. She scurried back. The door she leaned upon burst open. She fell. The hard ground stole her breath. Then men descended upon her. Jack charged through the woods with his 4 brothers trailing just behind. They had been tracking the Redesdale coach for nearly 3 miles, waiting for the flat landscape to give way to a hill from which they could descend upon their prize. Having at last reached a wooded slope, Jack galloped to the top and signalled for them to don their masks. They had moved ahead of the coach, but it was almost upon them. He leaned low in his saddle. The thrill of the catch set his heart to race. Moisture beaded against the fabric of his mask as his breath quickened. He raised his fist in the air, preparing his brothers to attack. Once his fist swung down, they would be unleashed like a furious black storm upon the unsuspecting nobles. Almost there. Just a few yards to go. His breath hitched as a great crack rent the air. He jerked upright and stared with wide eyes at a tree on the other side of the road plunging in front of the coach. The driver pulled hard on the reins, but it was too late. The wheels thundered into the tree, splintering to pieces. Before Jack could draw his next breath, men, dressed in peasants' attire, sprung out from the woods with swords raised high and attacked his prize. He threw up his hands and let loose a string of curses. "What's our move?" Quinn said. Jack shook his head. "We have no move. Those thieves stole our prize." Rory tore off his mask. His blue eyes sparkled. "They're Scottish rebels. 'Tis as Bishop Lamberton predicted. Our people are once more ready to fight." "And look at how well they do against guards on horseback," Ian said. Jack shot a glance back at his youngest brother. His long red hair hung in tangled disarray. "Cover back up, lads. I want a closer look." Jack eased his horse further down the slope to watch the skirmish. The peasants were, indeed, making surprising progress. 3 guards were slain and the others would soon be overwhelmed. He leaned forward in his saddle and eyed the ragged gang. Their humble clothing bore the wear of toil, but their broad shoulders and thick waists belonged to men who did not know scarcity. Jack shook his head. "Look at their swords. Those aren't the weapons of farmers." "What does it matter?" Rory said. "They're fighting the English and winning." Jack's eyes narrowed on the scene below. "Something isn't right." Quinn nodded. "Look at the skill with which they fight." "They are not peasants," Jack said with certainty. His brothers fell silent as the last guard was pulled from his horse. Several blades glinted in the sun as the tips were plunged into the wretch's belly. "'Tis done then," Jack murmured. He was about to turn away, but then the coach door opened and a lady fell to the ground. Veils obscured her face. The fineness of her tunic bespoke of great wealth. Again he cursed their luck. Whatever fortune she carried with her should, by rights, be theirs. They had, after all, tracked her for miles. She disappeared behind a sea of men. Ian slid off his horse. "What are they doing?" Crouching low, he darted past an opening among the trees, then squatted behind a large copse. "Ian, 'tis nothing. She is in no real danger. Whoever these brigands are, they will not harm her. Not when they can ransom her for a sizable fortune. Come along, all of ye. The lady is no longer our affair. We certainly cannot rob her now." Jack urged his horse around, but then a sob rent the air. Several men fell on top of her, tearing at her clothes. A scream of pure terror sent chills up Jack's spine. "Perhaps I spoke too soon. Scottish rebels or not, we cannot allow them to hurt her," Quinn said. "Why not?" Rory said. "She's the enemy. We do not condone the rape of women, English or otherwise," Ian snapped. "Silence!" Jack hissed. One of the men ripped away the lady's veils. Tears streamed down her face. "Damnation!" he cursed while he beheld her wide, terrified eyes. Ian stood straight. "For the love of God, Jack!" Jack turned about. "Back to the horses, lads. We've an English lady to save." Chapter 4. Isabella screamed while men fought against her biting teeth, flailing legs and each other to stake claim to what was hers and hers alone. Fear devoured all thought, all hope. Her vision blurred. Their heaving bodies blended into the thick trees overhead, like one hungry claw bearing down upon her, ripping at her tunic, tearing at her soul. Then the claw shrank away. For an instant, sunbeams warmed her face. "Now is your chance. Get up. Run." Wincing, she lifted her head and gasped as black demons on horseback swung red blades, slaying her attackers. She climbed to her feet and started to run, only to stumble an instant later. She glanced back at what she had tripped over. Her heart seized. Thomas, the young man who had delivered her from her barren home with a message of birth, stared at her with unseeing blue eyes. A pool of blood cradled his head. She squeezed her eyes shut against the horror and jumped to her feet, then bolted into the woods. At last, having found her stride, she took flight, pushing her legs to work harder. She never looked back, but kept running, though her side ached and her lungs threatened to burst. And then a sound behind her expelled the wind from her sails. Hooves pounded through the woods, cracking limbs and tearing through the thicket. They were closing in on her. The ground shook. A sob tore once more from her lips as her toe caught on a thick root. She fell forward and flung her arms in front of her face in defence against the approaching ground, but she never felt the hard earth. Instead, she flew. A thick arm imprisoned her waist, and as if she weighed no more than a cloud, she was whisked through the air and tossed over the back of a racing horse. The ground hurried past. With every leap and turn, her stomach lurched. Grunts pushed past her lips. Just when she felt she could bear no more, the horse came to a halt. Still, she hung, frozen, too terrified to move. The only sound she heard was her own panting.
"Oh dear,"
she whispered as her stomach seized. Bile travelled full speed up her throat, and a gush of vomit spewed from her lips. "Sweet Jesus and Mary," a deep voice said above her, before strong hands gripped her waist and hoisted her off the horse onto her feet. "St. Augustine, get down here and help me," Jack growled at Quinn as he dropped to his feet and stood beside the trembling lass, his hands hanging limp at his sides. Quinn grimaced. "Oh, you're on your own." Jack grabbed his tunic and tore away a strip. "Here," he said, offering her the fabric. Still bent over, she slowly turned her head. She was terrified, that much he could tell. Pity bade him reach out to stroke her back, but her fine silk tunic and bejewelled fingers stayed his hand. She was a noble woman. She lived her life treading on the backs of men like him. More than that, she was English. loyal to a king who had slaughtered his parents and wee sister, and turned the city he had loved to ash. "Wipe your mouth and let's go," he snapped. She accepted the fabric and did as she was bid. His conscience pricked. He could not remember ever having spoken so harshly to a woman. She turned to face him. He was not prepared for her gentle beauty. Pale green eyes stood out in shocking contrast to rich olive skin. Her full lips trembled. He eyed her dirty wimple and wondered after the colour of her hair. She hurriedly wiped her hands before smoothing the cloth over her gown. Her small pert nose wrinkled with disapproval at her slippers, which were steeped in her own vomit. Jack shook his head. The lass had been attacked, nearly raped, and, for all intents and purposes, now had been abducted, and she was fretting over her shoes. High-born ladies were all the same, selfish and shallow. With a derisive snort, he roughly grabbed her by the waist and lifted her back up onto his saddle. Then he swung up behind her. Rory brought his horse alongside Jack's and grazed his fingers down the lady's arm. "What are we going to do with her?" Jack scowled, pushing Rory's hand away. Clearly, her beauty had not escaped his brother's notice. Even through his mask, Jack could see the glint in Rory's eyes. "Don't get any ideas, St. Thomas," Jack warned. "'Tis too late for that," Quinn said, shaking his head. Ian drew closer. "He's right though, Jack. What are we going to do with her?" "Stick to the bleeding code," Jack shouted. "Sorry," Ian said. "I just don't like this." "Neither do I," Jack snapped. He turned to Quinn. "What are our options?" "Well, we cannot leave her here. We could return her home," Ian suggested. Jack rolled his eyes at his youngest brother, even though he knew the gesture would be missed. "Do you think we can just ride into Berwick and hand Lord Redesdale his filth-covered princess and ride away once more? No questions asked?"
"Please, my father will reward you for my return."
Jack looked down at her. Her eyes darted from masked face to masked face. She trembled in his arms. Once more, pity struck his heart, only to be absorbed an instant later by a lifetime of prejudice. His compassion dissolved to anger. "You're not part of this conversation." She leaned away from him.
"But you rescued me, didn't you?"
Jack's scowl hid behind his mask. "Aye, and before that we were going to rob ye." Her eyes bulged wide.
"Let me go!"
she shouted. He grabbed her tight, pinning her flailing arms to her sides before her struggles sent her tumbling off his horse. Alec handed him a strip of cloth. Jack raised a questioning brow, but then remembered his mask. "What the hell is this for?" Alec shrugged. "Blindfold her. Then we ride." Without waiting for Jack's approval, Alec nudged his horse forward. The matter had been settled. "So be it," Jack said, turning to eye the lass once more. "Princess, you're coming with us." Chapter 5. Isabella had been attacked, nearly raped, and then abducted when her only wish had been to see her sister. At once, she realised the empty significance of her thought. After all, her mother's visit to the market had resulted in her death. On any given day, most people did not ask for much. Few were those who wanted it all, and would kill to take it. She lifted off the saddle, suspended in air for a moment while they presumably leapt over some obstacle in their path. She cursed the blindfold and the hand gripping her waist. At first, fear had clouded her every thought, while she had set off into the unknown, enclosed within the arms of her captor. It felt as if hours had passed, although, in truth, she knew it might have been mere minutes, so great was her panic. Still, somehow along the way, her heart had ceased its race and her breathing slowed. Her eyes had been rendered useless, and so she tried to use smells and sounds to guess their location. But the large, hard man holding her dominated her other senses. His breathing, loud and hot in her ear through his mask, muffled birdsong and the clomp of the horse's hooves. She could smell his body, rich and woody, and not unpleasant. His scent curled around her, wicked with persuasion, beckoning her exhausted body to lean back into his chest and surrender. She shook her head and straightened her spine. As if his scent had somehow penetrated her mind to peek at her thoughts, His hand shifted from her waist to her stomach. His fingers splayed wide and pressed her against his torso, forcing a gasp from her lips. Even through layers of kirtle, tunic and surcoat, she could feel his muscles shift and move as they rode. Never had she been so intimately acquainted with a man's body. His hand swept down her hip and for a moment rested on her thigh. She grabbed it and jerked it back up to her waist. At the very least, he was a man and not the demon she had imagined when she first glimpsed their masked faces and flashing swords. Men could be reasoned with. She cleared her throat and summoned her courage.
Return me to my father. He will reward you when I tell him of how you saved me from those thieves.
Those men were not thieves, he snapped.
Of course they were thieves,
she said. Nay, princess. His masked lips brushed her ear. We are thieves. Those men were murderers and rapists. Her hand flew to her throat. Thieves, murderers and rapists? How could this be happening to her?
You really did save me, didn't you?
She heard him sigh. Evidently, he had no wish to be reminded. Aye, and if you value your life at all, you'll remain silent now until I tell you to speak. She was about to remind him that from his own lips he was no murderer, but she decided to keep her silence and not push him toward a new occupation. "Oh, damnation, Jack! What have you done?" Abbot Matthews said, eyeing the lass in Jack's lap when the saints galloped into camp. The abbot of Haddington Monastery had been awaiting their return. He was one of Jack's gracious benefactors and allowed Jack and his family to live in hiding on monastic land. "For pity's sake, Abbot, what of the code?" "Blast the code! The code was your idea. You've kidnapped an English lady. Unless you're planning on wearing that mask until we can figure out how to get her back over the bleeding border and into her bleeding fortress, then I'm afraid you've rendered the code useless, St. Peter." The abbot raked his hands through his thinning brown hair. "How could you jeopardise all we've accomplished with this rash move? What are you trying to prove?" "We had no choice. Her coach was attacked." The abbot threw his arms up. "Of course it was attacked! You attacked it!" "Will you just listen to me?" Jack said. "We were trailing our coach, waiting for the opportune moment when villains, real ones, rushed the road, killing our guard." "Who were they?" Abbot Matthew asked. Jack lifted his shoulders. "In appearance they were peasants, though they fought like warriors." He motioned to Quinn. "Bring the sword." Quinn held it out for the abbot to examine. How would a peasant be in possession of such a fine weapon? "Aye, how indeed," Abbot Matthew said as he ran his fingers down the gleaming blade. Jack jerked his head towards the lady now huddled on the ground. "They would have damaged her had we not intervened. And then what were we to do? Leave her out there alone to fend for herself?" The abbot scratched at the faint whiskers dotting his chin. He looked at Jack. "Well, that does change matters. I will go now and send a message to Bishop Lamberton, although I cannot imagine how he will react." A breeze cut through the forest, ruffling his long black robe. "Work out a way to ensure she can't identify you." Jack watched the abbot disappear into the forest. Then, with brows raised, he looked at his brothers. "You heard the good abbot. What are we going to do?" "The solution is simple," Alex said before turning away and heading toward his hut. "Keep her blindfolded." "Nay," Ian snapped. "That would be cruel." "Then put her in the hole," Alec called over his shoulder. "You needn't be so unfeeling," Ian called after him. Then he turned to Jack. "Let's just be clear. You will not put the lady in the hole. I'll not have it." "'Tis not a terrible idea," Quinn said. "We would give her some blankets." Ian shook his head, then turned about on his large feet. "What are you doing?" Jack said as Ian marched over to the lady, hugging her knees to her chest. Jack knew she must have been terrified. His conscience pricked again, but the desire to comfort her was chased away by the jewels adorning her headdress. Not surprising, however, was his youngest brother's unfailing compassion. Ian's kindness knew no limit, but danger to any man who invited Ian's fury. His temper, once provoked, was a fearsome sight. Jack watched Ian closely as he dropped to one knee in front of the lass. She visibly tensed, clearly having sensed Ian's presence. Ian unsheathed his dirk. I'm putting an end to this debate. The lass scrambled away. Hush now, lass, Ian crooned, reaching for her. This will not hurt. Both Jack and Quinn lunged for Ian as his knife started toward the lady's head, but then, in one quick motion, her blindfold fell away. Isabella blinked against the light as she scurried away from the large, black boot, but it followed after her. Her eyes travelled from the boot up a thick long leg. Corded muscles strained against the owner's fitted hose. Her eyes journeyed further, beyond the impossibly large chest to the terrific masked facade. She screamed when the large man squatted in front of her. Oh, sorry. He reached for the top of his head and pulled off the mask. Her mouth dropped open in shock. A nervous giggle came unbidden to her lips. She had never been so surprised as she stared up into the kind, blue eyes of a young man no older than she. He had handsome features, a wide grin, and long flaming red hair that fell below his chest. She had expected someone menacing, toothless, monstrous even. Not a lad. Ian, get away from her! She looked past Ian to one of the three masked men standing in front of her. She recognised the voice as belonging to the man with whom she had ridden, the man she had assumed to be the leader. Ian winked at her. I'm going to pay for this one. He stood up and backed away. Now what do we do? It was the masked man on her right who spoke. The man in the middle cursed before his hands reached out and yanked the mask off the heads of both men flanking him. The man on her left flashed her a smile that might have made her knees weak if received at court. But in a primitive camp full of thieves, it served only to fuel her fear. So too did the lecherous glint to his eye as his gaze roved over her with slow deliberation. His tongue wet his full, sensual lips. My name is Rory, my lady, he said with a bow. His beauty was wicked. Thick black lashes framed pale blue eyes. Curly black hair grazed his shoulders, framing his chiselled jaw. Without returning his greeting or making her own introductions, she tore her eyes away and took in the other unmasked man. Quinn, my lady, he said with a bow. Quinn appeared older than both Ian and Rory, but only by a handful of years. Quinn's good looks were not as flashy as Rory's, but his rich black hair shone in the sun, and his dark eyes scrutinised her with an intelligent air. Once again, she returned no greeting, nor did she reciprocate introductions. Not that it mattered, as they would have learned her family name from the coat of arms displayed on her carriage. Princess, the man in the middle said, his voice dangerously soft. She narrowed her gaze as she strained to see through the mask still concealing his face. Follow me, he said. He started towards a small thatched hut that stood beneath the shade of a large oak tree. Her feet froze in place. Even if she had wished to follow, she could not. Weary and afraid, she simply could endure no more. She had no intention of following the large, masked stranger into the small enclosed space. As you wish, my lady, he growled. Then he stormed towards her. If she had sprouted wings, she would have been no less surprised. Lifting her skirt far too high for decorum, she bolted across the small clearing. For 3 blissful seconds, she thought she had escaped. That is, until a hand clamped down on her upper arm. He jerked her around, tossed her over his shoulder, and stormed towards the hut. Once inside, he set her on her feet. The room was as poor and rustic as the thatched exterior. She glanced at the pallet and table with 2 rough-hewn chairs, her gaze lingering on a thick loaf of bread at the centre of the table. Taking a deep breath, she turned to face her captor. He still wore his menacing mask. She had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He stepped towards her, causing her breath to catch. She backed up several steps, never taking her eyes off of him. He pointed to one of the chairs. Sit. She eyed the chair but then shook her head. She wanted to stay poised to flee or to ward off an attack. Suit yourself, he said as he collapsed into one of the chairs with a heavy sigh. His hand reached over his head and pulled the mask off. Then he laid his head back against the thatched wall, closing his eyes. Confused by his casual air, she did not know what to do or say. Had he dismissed her? She eyed the doorway, wondering if he would notice if he slipped out. She looked at him once more. Wavy black hair fell from his upturned face. Long, thick black lashes rested on his cheeks as he continued to close his eyes. She shifted her gaze from his face to the door and took one step in that direction. But his hand shot out, grabbing her forearm. "You're no going anywhere, Princess," he said, his voice low and husky. She yanked her hand free and pressed her back against the wall. They locked eyes. His were black and intense, yet not unkind. A smile, seemingly sad and pensive, tugged at one corner of his mouth before he turned away from her once more. It was clear he was not ready to deal with her, or mayhap he did not know how. His fatigue was apparent, but she sensed there was more to his meditation. He rubbed his eyes and shook his head. Then he stared transfixed at the wall, and his features relaxed, as if he gazed at peaceful beauty. She imagined he stared beyond the thatched wall, at a conjured meadow or steady sea, like a quiet soul in the midst of a world on fire. His hand reached above his head and grabbed the back of his tunic, yanking it off. Her mouth dropped open as she stared at his bare torso. His wide chest was sprinkled with black hair that thinned into a line down the ridges of his stomach, disappearing beneath the narrow waist of his hose. He stood up and in 2 strides crossed the room and opened a lid to a wooden chest. A gasp tore from her lips. His hose hung low. She could see the curve of his buttock. He did not flinch when he heard her outburst, nor did he acknowledge her obvious discomfort. Pulling on a fresh linen shirt, he returned to the table, taking up a hunk of bread. The renewed sight of food made her stomach growl, betraying her need. Hunkered low over his meal with both elbows on the table, he took a large bite and said, gesturing with the bread to the chair across from him, "You're welcome to join me, Princess." She shook her head. She would have loved to eat, but dared not go any closer. "Sit!" he snapped. "Eat!" His black eyes flashed with anger. The quiet soul had given way to the thief. Her heart quaked. She felt like a cornered mouse surrounded by a hungry wolf. Perhaps she could request a change of guardsmen. Not Rory. His roving eyes revealed exactly what he would do to her if they were alone near a soft pallet and warm blanket. There was Quinn, who had seemed like the perfect gentleman, allowing she overlooked that his voice belonged to the man who seemed amenable to sticking her in the hole. Whatever that was. Ian, with his kind blue eyes, was perfect. Although given the great unmasking he instigated, she seriously doubted she would be left in his gentle care. Anyway, none of them were there. Just she and this man who moved like a sleek cat, smelled like the woods, and exuded power. He was a man clearly used to being obeyed. A dangerous man, an unpredictable man, a man who was very unhappy that she was there. A terrible combination with her at its perilous centre. She closed her eyes and, squaring her shoulders, she sat down, fanning out her soiled tunic. After crossing her ankles, she tore off a piece of bread and took a bite. She could feel the weight of his eyes on her. Sweet Jesus, she wanted to run. But what would happen to the mouse if the wolf caught her? He looked at her. His eyes started out cold, then flashed with fire. "What's the question biting at your tongue?" She jumped a little in her seat, but then swallowed her fear.
"Are you going to kill me?"
He smiled, and then, to her surprise, he threw his head back and laughed, showing white, even teeth. Her eyes widened with surprise. She certainly found nothing at all diverting about her question. "Fair enough, Princess. Let me put your mind to rest. I have no wish to hurt you. Earlier today I would have taken your last coin and all your bonny jewels, but my brothers and I would never have harmed you."
"All of those men are your brothers?"
she asked. Her voice sounded small and soft, unrecognisable to her own ear. She was Lady Redesdale. She too was used to obedience. She sat a little straighter, imbuing her posture with strength she hoped would spread to her whole person. He nodded in answer. She took another bite of the bread.
"Why did you save me?"
He shrugged and looked away.
"Have I wronged you somehow, or are you merely angry because you did not get your chance to rob me?"
She felt her ire rising. She was tired of being afraid, and she would be damned if she was going to explain herself to a common highwayman. She jumped to her feet.
I demand you return me to my father, or if you wish you can take me on to my intended destination, my sister's home at Ravensworth Castle.
You can keep your orders to yourself, Princess. As I've said before, you're not going anywhere.
If it is money you desire, then I assure you, my father will pay handsomely for my return.
You've had my answer, he said. She scowled, turning away. Sweat had gathered on her brow. The heat and stress of the day were undeniable. She pulled a handkerchief from beneath the cuff of her sleeve and dabbed at the beads cascading down her temples. He grabbed her arm and jerked her back around. I'll never ken a noblewoman's attire. You're suffocating yourself in all that fuss.
You speak as if I had some say in what I wear.
She paused and blatantly passed her gaze over his homespun shirt and hose.
Like your own attire, my dress is befitting my station.
For a moment, a sneer twisted his rugged features. She had pushed too far. He stepped forward and, to her surprise, his face softened. He cupped her cheeks between his rough palms and leaned close. She trembled beneath the warm currents of his breath. Why must convention cover a woman's hair? His fingers slid under the sides of her wimples where it met her cheeks. It is almost always her greatest beauty. His lips grazed her skin, causing her heart to skip a beat. Before she could draw her next breath, he ripped the fabric, exposing her head and neck. Her body betrayed her as a sigh of relief escaped her lips, having been released from her own personal prison. "What is your name?" he said, uncoiling her hair.
Bella,
she breathed.
Isabella.
He laced his fingers through her freed hair. Did he think the colour beautiful? Her sable brown locks had always seemed plain to her at court. Oh, for pity's sake, what did it matter? She should have been fighting his presumptuous attention. He was a thief and her abductor. She met his gaze with the intention of telling him exactly what he could do with his wandering hands. But the moment their eyes met, she was struck by his intensity. God's blood! If he had wished to unnerve her, he had succeeded. She felt vulnerable and exposed. His hands dropped to his sides and he turned his back on her. Her courage returned.
If you were a gentleman, you would take me home.
He whirled around and crushed her against him. Never mistake me for a gentleman, Princess. He pressed a kiss hard to her lips. She pushed against his chest and struggled in protest, but he held her fast. Then his lips softened. His hold softened. She softened, lulled by his whispered caress. He tore his lips away. He was as unpredictable as a summer storm. Without thinking, she drew her hand back and slapped him hard across the face. His head snapped to the side. She held her breath, thinking the end was nigh. He rubbed his cheek, his lip tugged into a lazy, sideways grin. "You've gumption, my lady," he said, before turning to leave. Then, over his shoulder, he said, "I like that in a woman." Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to enjoy more videos like this one, click the thumbs up button and subscribe to our channel. See you next time out in the Highlands.